Hi, this is Erin, and welcome to Everything EFL, my little podcast about English language teaching and other teachy stuff too. Credit and honourable mentions will be given during the episode or in the show notes. Let's crack on. Hello, welcome back if you're a frequent listener. If you are brand new, you are most welcome. I'm delighted to have you here. Right, so bite-sized learning, what is it? Okay, so I heard this phrase a few years ago when I was watching a webinar. It basically said that a lot of young people now only really see or take in information in bite-sized chunks. Now, in this age of social media, everyone is just bombarded from every angle. You know, your brains can only take in so much information. I know mine can. So it's a 2-minute video here, it's a 3-minute article there. You know, myself, if it doesn't grab my attention in the first 30 seconds, I zone out. So I imagine that class is very much like this, especially when you're talking about the present perfect and the past simple. So students come to class. We expect them to focus for longer periods of time. So I started thinking about my typical grammar lesson. You have your lead-in, your presentation, your CCQs, your control practice, your free practice, all in one lesson. It's one big grammar fest. It's one amazing student-centered activity after another until we run out of time, with a nice little warmer at the beginning and possibly a little game at the end if they're lucky. Perfection. But doing all of that in one lesson, I mean, it doesn't mean they've got it. I think the brain works best if it's allowed to take in a little piece of information at a time instead of presenting and practicing everything in one day. Isn't it better to do a bite-sized chunk every day? Now, also with teaching online, you know, this changed the time frame. Everything takes longer. So I found it impossible to do everything that I needed to do in that time with the review, the warmer. So I adapted my teaching style to this bite-sized learning, but I think I'm going to keep it for when I go back into the physical classroom. Now, allow me to explain. Now, I touched on this last week with my episode about Jamboard. You might just want to check that out. But I'm just going to explain. I'm going to divvy up some lessons over the course of a week. So I'm going to first of all talk about grammar, then vocabulary, and then vocabulary from reading text or listening transcripts. But the good thing is you can take a little bit of all of these things and use them in one lesson, because if you're doing bite-sized chunks, you're doing a bit of grammar and then you're switching to vocabulary and then you're switching to something else. So there's this kind of momentum going on. The students know that it's going to be quick, it's going to be fast, we're going to go from this to this, and we're also going to come back to it the next day. So I just felt like it was moving the lesson along in a much more efficient way. So I'm going to start with grammar, okay? So maybe on one day I'll do the presentation, you know, take questions and all of that, and then give them an exercise for homework. The next day they can check the homework and maybe just do one control practice, maybe produce some sentences together using the grammar. And then again the next day, maybe they make questions using the grammar. And then the next day they answer the questions using the grammar. Rinse and repeat, you know, tailor activities so that by the end of the week they're producing language independently. They've had the scaffolding of this daily review, so hopefully they'll be well able to produce something with all of that behind them. Okay, now for vocabulary. This is perfect for bite-sized learning, okay? So I've got it in 2 categories. The first one is kind of like your typical vocabulary list that you might find in a course book. You know, they might give you a list of 10, something like that. The first day, you're going to introduce your list, you know, however you do it, you're matching to meanings, matching to pictures, CCQs, concept checking questions. There'll definitely be an episode about that very soon. And then possibly just give them something like a gap fill for homework. So again, just a little bit. And then the next day you check the homework, or students check the homework, and then possibly give them another exercise like, are these sentences correct? So have some sentences that use the vocabulary correctly, some that don't. And then the next day, again, introduce questions using the vocabulary so the students can discuss them. So, for example, I mentioned adverbs last week, bitterly cold, okay? You could write a question like, have you ever experienced a bitterly cold winter? You're contextualizing, you're personalizing. Maybe if the class is strong, the students can produce the questions themselves. That gives them autonomy, and then you can monitor. And then the next day, they can answer the questions. Okay, if you are producing the questions, they just answer the questions there and then. If they are doing it, they spend one day creating the questions, and then the next day you can come back and they can answer the questions. And then maybe the next day they can produce some independent sentences, and then they can check in their groups. Online, I would use Jamboard. Again, check out last week's episode. If you're in the physical classroom, maybe use flip chart paper or whiteboards around the room. Students can take pictures or copy the vocabulary or the questions. If you're a quick typist, you could sit at a laptop and type the questions as students write them. There are lots of different options. You know your class better than me, and you probably got more imaginative activities. This is just a little idea for you, okay? So the other kind of vocabulary is vocabulary from reading texts or listening transcripts. So after you've done the listening or reading, maybe the next day add an extra stage. Text analysis. Why don't you focus on collocations or useful phrases? You can do it together. Alternatively, students can just underline any nice phrases from 2 to 5 words in length that they like, or maybe underline all the phrasal verbs, something like that. But this kind of thing is great for pinpointing kind of natural language. And then the next day, you can do a review. You go back over the text, underline the collocations or phrases, or they can talk about the favourite ones from all of the phrases that were underlined in the class and why. The next day, a gap fill or an error correction. Create a discussion using questions with the vocabulary that the students chose, or maybe they can do it themselves. The next day, they produce sentences with something similar. So the point here is there's lots of speaking and collaborating going on if you make these tasks collaborative. So online, it's easy to do with Jamboard. Jamboard is very communal. Students are responsible for moving through the tasks with you monitoring them. If you're in the classroom, train your students to communicate and complete tasks together. If they're lower level, give them loads of phrases so they can communicate. Monitor them hard, okay? Make sure they're using the language. For example, what's number 1? Do you agree? Let's move on. If they have this language, if you've taught them this language to begin with, they will be able to communicate and collaborate together. Group them according to ability and pace. Check out episode 47 for more ideas on that. It makes it easier to monitor for you as well. It gives faster students more to do, or you can make the tasks a little deeper and more complex. Does it sound like a lot of prep? Maybe, but if you use the same course book again and again, it's not. So I'm going to do something similar to what I did last week. Last week, I just talked about how to use Jamboard, and it did incorporate bite-sized learning. Here, I'm going to give you another typical week, but everything's incorporated. So we have like grammar, we have vocabulary, we have everything incorporated into each day, but it's bite-sized, so you'll see the progression. Okay, so you have to bear in mind that you have other possibly longer activities as well, or maybe you don't. Some of you only have 45 minutes, some of you have 4 hours, but this is how I would incorporate bite-sized grammar and vocabulary. So Monday, possibly we do a review of something we did last week. 20 minutes, move on. Introduce some vocabulary. Let's say on Tuesday you're going to read a text, okay? Introduce the pre-teaching vocabulary on the Monday. Okay, and then go into your grammar. Maybe you're doing grammar today. This is where you do your lead-in, your guided discovery, and some questions, CCQs. Set them something for homework, like a gap fill. Tuesday, they check their homework, 10, 20 minutes, bite-sized. Moving on, one scaffolded activity to produce the language from the grammar. Could be just something very simple like produce a sentence using the grammar, or, answering questions using the grammar. Keep it simple. And then move on to vocabulary again. Review the vocabulary that they did yesterday for the reading. Do the reading and the questions. On the Wednesday, another grammar activity, maybe slightly less scaffolded this time. Maybe they work alone and then come back and check each other's sentences or something like that. Your choice. And then go back to the vocabulary. You follow up the reading with... Usually when you do a reading or a listening, you have a follow-up activity, even if it's like discussion questions or maybe write a letter or something like that. This is when you do the follow-up activity, okay? And then the next day, maybe you're doing another grammar activity to reinforce what they've done. Again, something slightly more independent. Again, check out last week's podcast for some ideas. And then you go back to the reading text or the listening transcript, and let's say you underline all the phrasal verbs or something like that. Okay, and then on the Friday, you would come back to that. You would possibly have a look at those phrasal verbs again, test the student's memory of them in a way, a game, a Kahoot, something like that. And then I would continue that on the Monday and the Tuesday and the Wednesday, just a small bite-sized activity where they're constantly reviewing and using that language. So everything is just in small chunks. So what do you think of that, guys? I'd really love to know your opinion. Do you think this would work better in shorter classes or longer classes or both? Do you have any interesting ideas how you can review grammar and vocabulary? Because I've just kind of given you a few basic ideas. I'm sure you have a million better ones than me. And as always, I would love you to share this episode or the podcast with a friend or a colleague. I would also ask you to hit that subscribe button so that I will just land in your podcast player every week and you don't have to worry about it. If you want to get in touch with me, guys, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, I'm on LinkedIn as well. So as always, have a safe, healthy, peaceful week and share the love. Bye.